Fire Captain Engineering, situation critical.
All available personnel on the double. Spock with me.
Superhero movies ruled the box office, before streaming platforms fought over exclusive content, and before fandoms could organize a global campaign with a single hashtag. A small, underfunded science fiction show quietly changed television forever. It premiered on September 8, 1966, on a network that barely believed in it, with a budget that forced its crew to invent solutions out of thin air. Nobody involved knew they were building one of the most enduring franchises in entertainment history. Here are 20 strange, surprising, and largely forgotten stories from behind the scenes of the original Star Trek. When Gene Roddenberry first sold the concept of Star Trek to NBC, William Shatner wasn't even part of the conversation. The network had already fallen for actor Jeffrey Hunter, who had recently played a memorable leading role in a major biblical epic. Hunter starred in the very first Star Trek pilot as Captain Christopher Pike, a quieter, more introspective commander than the one audiences would later come to know. After that pilot wrapped, Hunter chose not to continue with the project. Accounts differ on exactly why. Some point to his wife's discomfort with a television commitment. Others suggest he simply didn't see the show's potential. Either way, the role opened up, and William Shatner walked in with a completely different energy. Brasher, warmer, more impulsive. The show's entire personality shifted the moment he took the chair. Hunter passed away just a few years later, having no idea that the project he'd walked away from would still be talked about 6 decades on. The pointed-eared science officer we know today wasn't the character's first design. Roddenberry's earliest notes for Spock described a much more sinister look, with skin that leaned toward a deep, reddish hue meant to feel alien and unsettling, closer to a devilish figure than a calm, logical officer. But there was a practical problem. In 1966, most American homes still owned black and white television sets. A strong red tone would have translated into a heavy, almost menacing black on those screens, sending an entirely different message than intended. The production team pivoted to a muted yellow-green tint instead, subtle enough to avoid controversy on color sets, and safe enough not to look monstrous in black and white. Ironically, once color broadcast became standard, most viewers barely registered the tint at all. It was the ears, not the skin, that made Spock unforgettable. Ask any fan to name their favorite piece of Star Trek technology, and the transporter usually wins. The idea of breaking a human body down into energy and reassembling it elsewhere feels like pure imagination. In reality, it was pure economics. The show's original plan involved landing the Enterprise's shuttlecraft on alien worlds for every away mission, a visually exciting choice that the production simply couldn't afford. Building and filming a convincing shuttle landing every week would have drained the budget in a matter of episodes. Instead, the crew devised something far cheaper. Glittering particles filmed falling in front of a black backdrop, then played in reverse. It cost next to nothing and looked strange enough to feel futuristic. That inexpensive shortcut eventually became one of science fiction's most iconic images, inspiring decades of real scientific curiosity about whether teleportation could ever move beyond fiction. Television networks rarely give a show a second chance after rejecting its pilot, but Star Trek got exactly that. The first pilot episode, built around a slower, more philosophical tone and featuring a female second-in-command, was turned down flatly. Executives felt it moved too slowly, lacked action, and pushed too hard against expectations for the era, particularly with a woman serving as the ship's first officer. Rather than shelving the project, NBC took the unusual step of commissioning a second pilot. Roddenberry restructured the cast and tone, introducing Kirk and leaning into a livelier pace. The rejected footage from that first pilot didn't go to waste, though. Years later, it was woven into a 2-part episode that went on to win one of science fiction television's most prestigious honors, turning what had once been considered a failure into an award-winning piece of television. Nichelle Nichols, playing communications officer Lieutenant Uhura, held a role that was quietly radical for its time, a black woman in a position of authority on a major television bridge crew, treated as a competent professional rather than a background character. Despite the significance of the role, Nichols considered leaving the show after its first season, drawn by an opportunity on Broadway. She had already prepared her resignation when, at an NAACP event, she found herself in conversation with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He told her that Uhura mattered, that for the first time, children across the country could watch television and see someone who looked like them portrayed with dignity and authority in a vision of the future. Nichols withdrew her resignation the very next day and later described that single conversation as one of the most consequential moments of her life. Today, it's impossible to separate Leonard Nimoy from the character of Spock, but during production, Nimoy carried real doubts about the role. He worried the pointed ears and greenish tint would make the character look absurd rather than compelling, more of a novelty monster than a serious performance. He also faced a genuine acting challenge. Portraying a being who suppressed nearly all outward emotion required him to rework habits built over years of more expressive stage and screen work. What ultimately won him over was audience response. Rather than seeing a gimmick, viewers connected with a quiet tension underneath Spock's composure, the sense of a character wrestling with feeling rather than lacking it. Nimoy would go on to write 2 memoirs decades apart, one reflecting his early frustration with being typecast, and one embracing the character fully, a small window into just how much his relationship with the role evolved. In November 1968, an episode aired featuring a kiss between Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura, now remembered as one of the earliest interracial kisses shown on American primetime television. What's less well known is how hard network standards teams pushed back against it. The initial demand was to frame the kiss as something forced upon the characters by outside telepathic manipulation, rather than a moment either of them chose. A workaround meant to give more conservative markets an excuse to dismiss its significance. During filming, Shatner and Nichols reportedly kept ruining the safe takes where their faces stayed apart, leaving the director with little choice but to use the take where the two actually kissed. The network got its technical loophole. The scene still made its mark. Nichols later spoke about hearing from viewers whose perspectives had genuinely shifted after watching it, proof that a few seconds of television could ripple far beyond the screen. Star Trek never pulled strong ratings during its original broadcast run, and NBC considered pulling the plug after both its first and second seasons. What happened in response had almost no precedent in television history. Viewers organized letter-writing campaigns on a massive scale, flooding network offices with mail, circulating petitions on college campuses, and even staging small demonstrations outside NBC's offices, all without the internet, social media, or any of the organizing tools fans take for granted today. The pressure worked. NBC renewed the show for a 3rd season, a decision even announced publicly at a fan convention. That final season turned out to be its weakest, hampered by a shrinking budget and a poor time slot, and the show was canceled for good in 1969. But those extra episodes gave Star Trek just enough of a library to qualify for syndication, the decision that would ultimately determine its entire future. The 11-foot filming model of the USS Enterprise remains one of the most recognizable spacecraft designs ever created, but the model builders cut a very practical corner. Every camera angle used during filming approached the ship from the side or from above, so there was simply no reason to invest time or money detailing the underside of the hull. The visible surfaces were carefully painted, weathered, and lit to sell the illusion of a massive starship. The underside, by contrast, was left rough and largely unfinished. That original model now resides in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, a quiet reminder that even legendary props were built with an eye toward exactly what the camera needed to see, and nothing more. Few phrases in pop culture are as instantly recognizable as "Beam me up, Scotty." It's been printed on merchandise for decades and even referenced by astronauts on the International Space Station. There's just one problem. That exact sentence never appears anywhere in the original series. Kirk says close variations across different episodes, phrases like "Scotty, beam me up," or "Enterprise, beam me up," but never that precise combination of words. It's a strange but common phenomenon in popular culture, where the phrase people remember drifts from what was actually said, eventually becoming more famous than any of the real dialogue it was based on. With dozens of alien civilizations to depict across 3 seasons, the show's costume department needed to work miracles on a limited budget. Rather than designing every alien outfit from scratch, they frequently pulled from a massive wardrobe archives that major studios maintained from decades of earlier film and television productions. Roman-style robes became ceremonial alien attire. Western-era costumes were repainted and reworked into the clothing of distant civilizations. Old science fiction props from earlier decades received fresh paint and new insignia before returning to the screen as something entirely different. It was resourceful, fast, and effective, because on a television screen, an illusion only needs to hold together for a few seconds at a time. The phaser is one of science fiction's most recognizable weapons, capable of everything from a gentle stun to full disintegration on screen. Its origin story is considerably less dramatic. The prop department's early hand phaser designs were built from inexpensive plastic ray gun toys already sitting in studio storage, left over from earlier low-budget productions. Designers added new paint, new detailing, and small mechanical touches to make the toys look like sophisticated future weapons. Under close inspection, some of that plastic origin remained visible, but under studio lighting and paired with the right sound design, the illusion held up perfectly. Decades later, real-world research into directed energy weapons would cite Star Trek's phaser concept as an early inspiration, a strange full-circle moment for a prop that began life as a children's toy. The beloved episode featuring an army of small, fuzzy, rapidly multiplying creatures is remembered as one of the show's funniest hours. What audiences never saw was the very real nuisance those props caused on set. The tribbles were built from synthetic fur stretched over foam, with tiny internal motors, giving some of them a gentle purring vibration. Under the intense heat of studio lighting, that synthetic fur built up significant static charge, causing the props to cling stubbornly to costumes, furniture, and camera equipment, and giving crew members the occasional small shock. With hundreds of tribbles needed for a single episode, the crew had to develop routines for discharging the props between takes just to keep production moving. An unglamorous, behind-the-scenes headache behind one of the show's most lighthearted stories. Longtime fans of genre storytelling will instantly recognize the idea of a red shirt, an anonymous supporting character who exists mainly to demonstrate danger by dying shortly after arriving on screen. Star Trek didn't invent the concept of a disposable character, but it gave the idea its enduring name. In the show's color-coded uniform system, red was worn by engineering and security personnel, the crew members most often sent into dangerous situations during away missions. Fans later noticed, and eventually documented, just how often those background red shirt characters met an early end. Ask someone today who Star Trek's signature villains are, and most will immediately say the Klingon. But in the original series, that role initially belonged to someone else. The Romulans appeared first, in an episode widely regarded as one of the strongest of the entire run, and were positioned as calculating, secretive adversaries who mirrored the tension of a real-world Cold War standoff. The Klingon arrived later as a more overtly aggressive threat, drawing their own set of real-world political parallels. While memorable from the start, they didn't dominate the original series' villain landscape the way later films and spin-off shows would eventually make them. It was subsequent Star Trek projects, released years afterward, that elevated the Klingon into the towering cultural presence fans recognize today. Captain Kirk's reputation as a man who trusts instinct over data wasn't an accident of casting. It was a deliberate storytelling choice baked into the writing from the start. Time and again, the ship's computer would deliver cold statistical warnings about the odds of failure, only for Kirk to override that logic and succeed anyway. It was the show's way of exploring a much larger question about intuition versus calculation, and about whether human judgment still mattered in a future increasingly shaped by machines. In 1966, with computers just beginning to enter mainstream awareness, that debate felt genuinely forward-looking. Decades later, as conversations about artificial intelligence and automated decision-making have only grown louder, that same argument between man and machine feels more relevant than ever. Gene Roddenberry envisioned Star Trek as more than pure entertainment. He wanted it to hold a mirror up to contemporary American society. That was a risky ambition in the politically tense atmosphere of the late 1960s, when network censors were highly sensitive to anything that seemed to directly address civil rights, the Vietnam War, or Cold War politics. So the writers found a workaround, wrapping difficult subjects in the safety of alien allegory. One well-known episode featured a humanoid species locked in generational conflict, split down the middle with opposite-colored halves of their faces, warring endlessly over which side was truly superior, a message that needed no further explanation. Other storylines quietly tackled war profiteering, corruption, and religious extremism, using distant planets and future centuries as a shield. Framed as science fiction, difficult ideas slipped past censors who might have objected to the same commentary delivered more directly. Not every behind-the-scenes story from Star Trek involves budget crises or social commentary. At one point during production, someone decided it would be a good idea to bring the cast into a recording studio for a full holiday album, and the results were as delightfully odd as that premise suggests. William Shatner brought his signature dramatic delivery to classic holiday songs, treating them less like carols and more like spoken-word performance pieces. Leonard Nimoy contributed a solemn spoken-word piece about the meaning of a season, narrated with the same gravity he brought to Spock. Other cast members joined in on more traditional festive tracks, creating a strange but genuinely charming curiosity. Originally intended as little more than a promotional novelty, the recordings eventually found their way into wider circulation and became a cult favorite among longtime fans. Proof that even the most serious science fiction crew could embrace a little seasonal silliness. Everything memorable about the original Star Trek, the alien makeup, the model spaceships, the elaborate looking sets, was produced on a budget that would look shockingly modest by today's standards. Sets were reused constantly, with the same basic corridor redressed to serve as everything from a starship hallway to an alien facility. Extras were frequently crew members pulled from other departments and dressed for a scene. Visual effects that would cost enormous sums today were achieved through painted backdrops, small-scale models, and careful editing tricks completed for a fraction of modern costs. By the third season, funding had shrunk even further, and the visible drop in production quality was noticeable to viewers at the time. And yet, stripped down to little more than its ideas and its performances, the show still managed to hold audiences, a reminder that ambition and imagination were doing far more heavy lifting than money ever could. Perhaps the strangest fact of all is that Star Trek was, by the standards of its era, a commercial failure. Ratings stayed mediocre throughout its original run, and the show was canceled after 3 seasons with unremarkable viewership. It should have quietly faded from memory. Instead, syndication changed everything. Local stations across the country began airing reruns in the early 1970s, and a new generation of viewers, many too young to have caught it the first time, discovered it in afternoon time slots and fell in love. Conventions sprang up. Merchandise followed. The cast slowly realized just how much cultural weight the show was accumulating, even years after cancellation. A feature film arrived in 1979, followed by more films, and, eventually, an entire family of spin-off series that has continued in various forms for nearly 60 years. Few shows in television history have staged a comeback as dramatic as this one, built almost entirely on the devotion of fans who refused to let it disappear. 20 facts. 20 small windows into a show that looked, on the surface, like a modest science fiction adventure running on a shoestring budget, and turned out to be something far bigger. Star Trek didn't just imagine the future, it helped shape it. Communicators inspired flip phones. Handheld tricorders foreshadowed modern diagnostic tools. Sliding doors, wireless earpieces, and tablet-style displays all echo ideas first sketched out by a production team working with far more imagination than money. Roddenberry once described his pitch as a frontier adventure set among the stars. But what audiences ultimately received was something far more lasting, a set of values wrapped in